Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bob Duffy. I live in Nashua, and I have a hobby of researching the American Civil War. I have been actively researching and recreating in Civil War uniforms the Civil War since 1980. I have been a part of a large community of people that have always shown an interest in that period in American history. Now, for tonight's presentation, I will bring you back to 1861. Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. The convention that nominated him was held in Chicago, as it will be again this year. He was actually nominated unanimously on the third ballot. The Republican Party platform had 12 points, of which 4 of them involved the abolition of slavery, which is the reason why the Republican Party was founded. Now, in the election, it was held, as it always is, on the second Tuesday of November. But by the end of November, South Carolina, the state legislature had already voted to resign from the Union. Several other states followed. Eventually, 11 states, governments, voted to secede from the Union, to leave the federal Union altogether. Now, New Hampshire, of course, was one of those that stayed loyal to the Union. And there were many different reasons for this. And I find it interesting that in every different book, you'll see different perspectives on what caused the Civil War. But basically, it comes down to one simple sentence, that the North fought to preserve the Union and the South fought to preserve slavery. It wasn't just a case of one issue back and forth. It's not like you can say World War II, why did we fight the Germans? Well, the Germans fought for one reason and the Americans fought for another. The North fought to keep America unified. The South fought because they saw that slavery was in danger of being abolished. Now, the issue of slavery had been going on for 40, 50 years. The American Revolution, when they wrote the Constitution and they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they argued about slavery and the whole issue about every man is equal before the law and all citizens have equal rights and all that stuff was bickered back and forth, and the southern states refused to include slaves as citizens. So even the Dred Scott case, which is the United States Supreme Court, ruled that a human being is private property and could not be free. So New Hampshire was the original home of Lloyd Garrison, one of the prominent abolitionists. So New Hampshire was very rural, and we didn't have a whole lot of people that were too excited about the issue of slavery because they didn't have slaves. It had been abolished 50 years before. There was no slaves in the state. And a lot of people just wanted to go about their day-to-day business on their farms. And the factories in New Hampshire were relatively new. The factories in Nashua were still new. I mean, if you walked into a factory in Nashua, one of these mill buildings during the Civil War, everything would smell new. You'd probably still smell the mortar. And you still smell the paint drying, because paint in those days was linseed oil mixed with lead and mixed with pigment. So that took like weeks or months to dry. So here we are, 1861. The South has already left. Several states have left. The President of the United States has asked for volunteers because the Southern states made the mistake of making the first overt act, which is that they fired on a federal installation in Charleston Harbor. So, of course, that's open rebellion against the federal government, so Abraham Lincoln asked for volunteers to put down the rebellion. And for many years, the title of the Civil War went back and forth. And some official histories call it the War of the Rebellion. Some call it the War of Northern Aggression. Some people call it the Civil War. It was not a civil war in the true sense, just as the American Revolution was not a revolution. It was the war for independence. It wasn't a revolution. So we are talking about if you were in the army back then, you joined to put down the rebellion. Now, I am in the uniform of a cavalryman because the primary reenactment group I belong to now is the 1st New Hampshire Volunteer Cavalry. Now, the Civil War itself introduced people to the modern world. I mentioned before that New Hampshire was pretty rural. If you were a farmer back in those days, you were working on a farm, you didn't really get to see what's going on. If you lived out in like Limeboro or even Mount Vernon, you wouldn't see the factories in Nashua. You might hear the whistle of a steam locomotive in the distance, you might have an idea what's going on. If you went to church on a regular basis, you might meet other people, and those people might tell you things that they read about in the newspapers, and then you hear some rumors about what the modern world is like today. Now, one of the aspects of comedy, which has all but disappeared, is the idea of a rube or a hick going to the big city. Now, most of us here remember those days where they had jokes about the farmer with the straw hat and the straw in there sticking out of the mouth as they're in a big city looking at the skyscrapers. Well, that's one of the basic parts of American comedy, and it existed back in the Civil War days too. There were people in the cities that took advantage of the farmers when they came in. Now, what was life like for these people, and why was it such a shock to see what we consider to be old technology? Well, farms in those days, the average farm in New Hampshire was 100 acres. That means that they barely grew enough food to support a full-size family. If you grew anything for money, it was probably hay, because hay was the #1 crop in the state. The #2 crop was corn, which was to feed animals, because very few people ate corn as a human being food. And even today in Europe, a lot of people consider corn to be animal food. And people in England, if you talk about corn, they tend to think of it as wheat. They'll say Indian corn rather than just plain corn like we know today. So you're growing up on a farm, you're a young man, you're helping out, chores day in, day out. If you're a girl on the farm, it's the same thing. There's never ending work. You never have a day off except for Sunday. And the only reason you have the day off is because they said you will do nothing on this day. You couldn't play games, you couldn't dance, you had to keep quiet. If you went to church, you spent the whole day at church. If you didn't go to church, then you couldn't play cards at home, and you couldn't play music. So it was kind of an interesting experience, because on Saturday you'd take a bath once a week, or at least clean up, because you wanted to have Sunday free. Growing up on a farm, you as a farm boy belonged to your parents. Anything you did, if you went someplace and did something like did a favor for somebody and he paid you, that wasn't your money, it belonged to your parents. If you helped out another farmer bring his crops in, your parents got the money, you didn't get it. And in those days, you were a minor if you were under the age of 21. And I think most people in this room here right now remember when you had to be 21 years old to vote. And that's why it was that way, because you were not considered to be a full-fledged, on-your-own person until 21. Now, when you join the U.S. Army, if you joined the Army before the age of 21, the Army enlistment forms had a space for your parents to sign for you. And I just recently came across a photograph of a document from New York State, from a recruiting center, where a man who was 20 years old, his father came to get him. And he had to go home. And the Army had to say, it turns out he left without his father's permission, so he's discharged. I mean, that a 20-year-old person today doesn't seem like the kind of thing they'd say, like, come with me, you're going back home. Unfortunately, that's the way it was back in those days, because farmers were workers and you needed the workers. One interesting aspect of it is that in New Hampshire, when a family had 3 or 4 boys, they didn't really split the farm up into each boy didn't get like 1/3 of the farm. And usually when you got to be age 21, you could ask for your inheritance and you'd be paid off. And with that money, you would go someplace and try and start your own farm, buy your own property, or just be an adventurer, go someplace, go out west, right? The old story, go out west, west, young man, right? So as a result, there was a lot of people over the 1850s and 1840s who were traveling around the country. And some of these people found that they could make money by writing about their adventures. And one of these guys was Mark Twain. So these people would write stories, which we can look back on today. We can see what life was like in America back in those days. And there were people who wrote travel books. I read an interesting translation of a Russian man who came to visit America in the 1850s. And of course, Alex de Tocqueville visited America back in the early part of the 1800s, and people still look at his writings. But when the war came and people heard that there was going to be a rally, and a patriotic rally, and people said, what's going on? It's like a circus coming to town. If you're living on a farm in the middle of no place, nothing goes on out of the ordinary. It's a day-to-day routine. This time of year right now, you're just basically eating whatever is left over in the basement, maybe some apples, some beets or something like that. You don't, maybe some preserved meat if you're lucky, but you don't have meat every single day. So it's a thrill to have something going on. You hear there's a rally going on. You can hear music in the distance. So you get in the wagons, you go into town, and you see there's banners up, colorful banners. There's some prominent people in town, maybe a few people in uniform out there, and they're giving speeches. And they're telling people that America needs you. Right now, the American system of government is in danger because the idea of having a fully elected government where everybody participates and casts a vote is in danger because some people just didn't want to play by the rules and they wanted to go their own way. So we are going to try and keep America united because we know that there are people out there that are being misled, and we don't want anybody to take American property, and that's what they did. The southern states actually seized all federal property in those states, including Federal Reserve banks and the gold that was in it. The Confederacy never minted coins. They used all the gold coins and silver coins that the U.S. government had, which were in bags in the mints, that they just walked in and they said, we don't recognize the authority of the federal government to be in our state. This belongs to us now. They did that with the customs houses and the ports, and they did that in the army bases. And all the army bases basically surrendered because the only men in the forts were the full-time regular army guys whose only job it was to make sure the bricks didn't start crumbling, make sure the cannons didn't rust. Because in those days, if you had a fort, like the Boston Harbor forts or Fort Constitution and Portsmouth and all that, the local people were supposed to go in and actually load and fire the cannons. They didn't have 2,000 soldiers stationed at those forts all the time. So as a result, there was basically caretakers in the forts. So when the militia of the different states showed up at the door with their weapons, the regular army guys said, well, what am I going to do? Fort Pickens in Florida, at the part of Florida that goes out by Louisiana, it was on a peninsula. He refused to surrender. The garrison in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter, they did not surrender. And Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, an island way off the coast of Florida. It was an island built on an artificial reef. Just the walls of the fort are the edges of the island. Even today, the national park service, you got to fly in and fly out. People get there and they say, when can I go back home? It's just so hot and dry and everything. It was used as a prison after the war. That's where Dr. Mudd, the guy who treated the leg of John Wilkes Booth, he was put in there as a prison. So those three facilities were the only facilities in the southern states that the Confederates or the states did not take away. So this young man is listening to these speeches. He's saying, wow, I didn't know all this stuff was going on. And they're saying, listen, anybody who joins, I guarantee you'll get $100 cash bounty from the federal government. We'll give you a state bounty. And the town, there's some rich gentlemen in the town of Nashua who are willing to put up an additional money. So you'll get an additional $25 cash per person for joining the Army. And they said, wow, that sounds like a pretty good deal. So sometimes they'd ask their parents and mother and dad and said, you know, I'm thinking about joining the Army. And if the father said, okay, then he would go there and he would say, I want to join the Army. And they'd say, okay, sign here. And you fill out the form. You get a physical examination. You had to be naked to a physical examination. You had to be 5'3" because they had to see, you couldn't have scars on your legs and stuff like that. You had to be able to walk. You had to have opposing teeth to tear open a cartridge. And you had to be basically physically fit. And to give you an idea, I cannot find the records from the Civil War, but in World War I, a little over half the men that were drafted from New Hampshire failed the physical. That's how hard life was on the farms. If you look at the pictures, everybody was skinny back in the old days. People didn't eat well. And they didn't eat well because, you know, they didn't have stores on the corner. People, you know, if you had a farm, you grew your own food, and that was it. And it had to last you. And you didn't have the cash to go buy food because there wasn't much of a cash economy. There was a lot of bartering going on. You might trade a couple of bushels of corn for a piglet, something like that. And then, of course, later on when your pig got fat, you ate that. Chickens were not that common, but of course, chicken, if most of us might remember, chicken was a special meal for Sundays. It wasn't something you had to have every day. And even, you know, Prince Spaghetti Day Wednesday, you know, there's a lot of people grew up having one day of the week, at least we didn't have any meat. So he joins the Army. But he doesn't just join the Army. He has to join a specific group. He has a choice whether he wants to join the cavalry, the artillery, or the infantry. This is the infantry symbol back in those days, which is a hunting horn. These are stamped out of brass, And they're not gold-plated, but they're just brass. And they were worn on their hats, as you can see here. Now, the differences are, of course, the infantry was the men who fire long rifles and they march. The artillery were men who had cannons, and they would ride on horses, and because the horses had to pull the cannons, you needed 6 horses to pull a cannon. And the cavalry, each man had his own horse. Now, there were plenty of people who didn't want to join the cavalry because they didn't want the responsibility of taking care of such a large animal. Many people grew up on a farm, knew how much trouble it was to ride a horse. I just saw in one of these newspapers, I brought here today, an advertisement for cavalrymen, and they said military knowledge or ability to ride is not a hindrance. In other words, don't worry if you can't ride a horse, we'll show you. And there's plenty of cases that, even to World War I, of guys who were introduced to horses. And horses had different personalities. Some horses are mean and nasty, and some horses are nice. So when they bought horses and they said, okay, this is your horse, you might get a horse that bites, that doesn't want to do what you tell it to do. So a lot of people didn't want to belong to the cavalry. But I'm wearing a cavalry uniform. The person I've represented is someone who did join the 1st New Hampshire Cavalry, or actually at that time, originally New Hampshire couldn't get enough people to join the cavalry to make a 1,000-man cavalry regiment. So they only had a couple of hundred, so they wound up putting those men into a Rhode Island cavalry regiment. The 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, first and only Rhode Island Cavalry. So they fought for 3 years before they had enough men from New Hampshire to make the 1st New Hampshire Volunteer Cavalry, which was formed in 1864 out of men that were left over that re-enlisted. So as a cavalryman, I join, and I sign the papers, and they say, come back to Nashua on this day. Turns out that there was a camp just outside Nashua for the recruits to gather. And they would take you up to Concord by train, and riding on a train is a big deal. Being on a farm, you never rode on a train. Just like a lot of people never flew on an airplane before they were in the Vietnam War. It was a big deal. So you get on a train, you're riding the cars, they called it, riding the cars. You're going 30 miles an hour, and you're holding onto your seat like, oh my God, this is terrifying. So you get to Concord, you get out, and there's a field of tents, and you get out there, and you're assigned a tent, and they start giving you your equipment, your uniform. They don't give you your guns, because your guns are given to you when you get down to the front. That's where they're issued to them. If you're joining a regiment that's brand new, you might get all this stuff, but a lot of guys joined, and when it's like recruits to join somebody or in the field. And a lot of people, I read an article recently where one man was reminiscing, saying that in some ways it's better to join a brand new regiment that's forming than to join a regiment that's already in the field, because if the regiment's already in the field, you're the new man. Everybody will play tricks on you and do all the kind of things to you. But if everybody goes down together, you're all together learning the same experience. So the man rides on the train, a locomotive. I have here a model of a steam locomotive of the period of the Civil War, and I'll point out some interesting things about it. First of all, of course, it is a wood-fired locomotive. The engineer stands in the back with the fireman. The fireman is the guy who actually opens the door and puts the wood in. The engineer has to watch the gauges to keep an eye on the steam pressure, because it can blow up. This is made out of iron. It's not made out of steel. The firebox is here on the bottom. Whoops, this piece came off. But there we go. So the fire is down here. This cylinder part between the smokestack and the firebox is hollow, with about 3 or 4 dozen steel tubes 1 inch in diameter, with a wall on each side perforated, and the tubes go lengthwise. Now the heat from the fire goes down through those tubes, and the rest is filled with water. Now that's what makes the steam, of course. Now the fire comes here, and the draft comes out the chimney, the smokestack. And a peculiar feature about the Civil War locomotives is the shape of the smokestack, right? And the reason it's that big is because they have a screen on the top. And that screen is to prevent ashes and cinders from blowing out. Now, I recently saw a picture in Scotland, I believe it was. They had a gathering of steam locomotives, and they're coal-fired ones. And of course, as soon as they pass, you can't see anything because of the smoke. I mean, we're not talking about steam, we're talking about smoke, all right? And Nashua had several rail lines come together here, and it's like 56 trains a day came to Nashua. And anybody who's lived near those things knows that if you put laundry out, it's going to turn gray in a day because of all the soot. Now, as the train is puffing along here, the smoke is coming out the top, and the train is passing through the smoke cloud that it's made. So anybody who opens up the windows, the smoke comes in. Cinders were notorious for burning holes in people's clothes while they're on a train. You only open the windows when you stood still. You didn't open the windows when they're moving on a steam locomotive. Coal didn't really come in till later because America has plenty of wood everywhere. Now, the cow catcher on the front, I think most people remember what cow catchers were, right? And that's there because there would be an animal or something on the track, and it's to prevent it from being run over. It would actually scoop up the animal and push it over to one side. That's why they call it the cow catcher. Again, a distinctive feature of the locomotives of the period. They don't have them on there today. Today, they need it for shopping carts that people leave on the tracks. So this in front here is the steam piston. There's one on each side. The steam produced by the fire going through the tubes is directed through this metal pipe to the steam box, and this box has got a shuttle in it that introduces the steam to the front part of the piston or the back part of the piston. So the steam actually pushes the piston one way, and it closes a valve, and then the steam pushes it the other way. So it goes back and forth. All right? And that goes to the same on both sides. This type of locomotive is technically called the 440 because it's got 4 wheels in the front, 4 on the back, and nothing else, just 440. So this is the most common general style. They made these type engines across the country, and Amoskeag factory was making locomotives and fire engines during the time of the Civil War. Now, one aspect about steam locomotives is you need water for boiling. Now, in the old movies, you see a Western movie, they often show the water towers. Right? It's usually, there's usually some comedy involved with somebody swimming in top. And the metal pipe that comes down, somebody always gets doused with water. Well, that's what this is. This is the tender, all right? This is the place where the water fills up because this entire area is filled with water. The wood is stacked on top here, and this channel is for the firemen to walk down to get the wood. So if you see a movie in the old days, this would be piled with cut wood. And people would have wood for sale along the way for the train. And you can see that it's this is the configuration shared by all those. That's why you had to have a tender with you. It was, the two were always together. You needed the water to go with it because they ran out. And that was why you see these water towers all the time in the old days. Now, of course, with coal, you still needed the water towers, but they just weren't as obvious as it was when you see in the old days with just this structure with this wooden barrel type thing on top. But they still use water. And in those days, they didn't have piped water like we know today. You just can't open a fire hydrant and fill it up. So they actually had to find a way to get the water into the tower. So once he arrives in Concord, he's already seen something which is astounding to him. And many people for generations, even today, toy trains are very popular because there's some aspect of the movement of the machinery that's fascinating to watch the wheels go around and just hear the noise in the pistons. Later on, when this engine was made, the steam from the pistons was vented sideways out to the sides. And you can see that if you see some old movies, you see a train pulling into the station, you see the steam on the tracks and all that. But later on, they found a way to divert the steam up to the smokestack, and that increased the draft, which increased the fire and the ability to make it more efficient. So you see the old trains, you'll see either steam coming out from the front, or you'll see the steam coming from the smokestack in that particular chug, 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 which is from the pistons themselves. So he gets to Concord, he sees this large field of white tents, and they're all made out of white cotton canvas, and they didn't need camouflage, so they just used plain white cotton. Cotton was a very popular product. Most of the mills here in New England were using cotton products. A lot of the clothing was made from cotton. Cotton was a very popular product, and of course that's one of the reasons why the Civil War started, was because slavery depended upon cotton because cotton was picked by hand. The cotton bolls themselves, the plants didn't all ripen at the same time. We could just yank the plant out of the ground and then do it. You had to go around and pick the cotton bolls as they're ripe and then go back a couple of days later and pick those ones which are ripe. So as a result, you needed some manual labor for that. And of course, it didn't even pay to grow cotton before Eli Whitney from New England went down south to stay at his relative's house. And they explained to him, and he said, well, that the big problem with cotton is that it's got seeds mixed into the white cotton ball, and it's a lot of deal. You got to actually somebody has to go one by one pulling the seeds out. So he said, there's got to be a better way. So he invented a system where you have a screen made of vertical strings, and you have a rotary drum, and on the drum are short wires made in like a fishhook shape, and they reach through the gap in the wire, grab the strands of cotton and pull it through, leaving the seeds on the other side. That's what the cotton gin is. Gin is abbreviation for the word engine, right? So he came up with this idea, and he never made a dime off of it because everybody just said, wow, what a great idea, I'll make one. He's like, wait. So that's an example of American ingenuity, which by the time of the Civil War was already worldwide famous. I mean, the whole idea was everybody knew that Americans were coming up with these fantastic ideas. In the few years before the Civil War, the United States Congress voted to decrease the amount of money that it took to get a patent from $30 to $15 to get a patent. So it was a lot easier, and patents were good for 17 years, and somebody had to pay you to use the patent. There were lawsuits all the time. Colt, the guy invented the Colt's pistol, was he had to fight all the time to keep his patents because everybody was copying them. So you're in Concord, you're in these tents here made in New England factories, which were themselves marvels of engineering because they had shuttles and looms, steam powered, going back and forth. People just had to wind them and reload them and keep the fabric going. There were separate buildings that did the printing for the fabric, and printed patterns were very popular. This is 1860. This was new stuff that your grandparents never saw. Because in the old days, everybody had to make their own stuff at home. They had to make what they call homespun. And the homespun, again, as I mentioned before about all that work thing, there was a distinct division of work between men's work and women's work. Women did the weaving, and they did the spinning and all that. They would take the sheep and shear the wool. And I tell kids sometimes that my uniform here is made out of sheep fur. And they do a double take because they don't really understand what it's from because they're so used to, they don't think about that stuff. But this is actually made from the sheep, the fur of a lamb, a sheep. This is wool. So the farmers had to do that, and they would take it themselves, and the ladies at home, the old spinning wheels and everything, they had to actually take the loose ball of wool and with their fingers kind of get it into like a little bit of a strand and then twist it using a weight, and then they would actually spin it around and try and make a strand, and of course that wasn't exactly the best thing around. And matter of fact, homespun fabric, this is an example of homespun fabric. You can pass that around. You can see how crude and coarse that is. The actual strands of fiber are not consistent like we think of thread today. It's usually bumpy with knots on it and everything, but that's the best they had back in those days. And your mother made your clothes, and if you had an older brother, you got his clothes when he was finished with it. So being on a farm, you didn't get new clothes, you didn't get nice clothes, you didn't get fancy clothes. And in the wintertime, you didn't have any winter clothes. You just had the same clothes. You put a couple of layers on maybe. And you might have only worn shoes during the wintertime because your father made shoes for you. And most people, even to the turn of the early 1900s, remember when they ran around all day long in the summertime without shoes on. And that's also short pants. A lot of boys didn't wear pants that went down past their knees until they were, full-grown men like teenagers. So he joins the army, and they give him a suit of clothes. And it's wool. It's not cheap cotton. And the nap on it is very fine. It's very nice. It's woven very well. It's made in good mills. It has nice trim on it. This is cotton trim, dyed yellow, because as a cavalryman, that's the color of the branch of service, is yellow. And you can see that it's also incorporated into the design of the jacket, covering up the seams. And you see these on the back. These are called, some people call them pillows, but they actually support the waist belt. You can see that? So that if I raise my arm, the jacket won't be pulled up out from underneath it. So if you're sitting on horseback, you want a jacket. You don't want a long coat because you don't want to sit on your tail of your coat when you're on the horse. So the cavalrymen were given this uniform. This is the standard U.S. Army trousers, sky blue trousers they called it back then. And I'll show you the shoes in a minute. The cap is made out of wool also, and it's a style adopted in 1857. The actual pattern, this is the government issue pattern, which is pretty homely looking. And during the war, many, many men chose to have a cap made privately. Enlisted men and officers. They just said, I want something like this cap I'm wearing now. It was a little distinctive, a little different, and a little bit nicer because people took some pride in what they wore. Now this hat only cost the government 57 cents. I'll pass this around so you can get an idea. This is an exact replica with a leather and wool. And I know people who taught themselves how to make those. Because as a reenactor, we learn a lot of stuff. I mean, I learned to do leatherworking. My belt was made by a friend of mine in New Boston. I have made Civil War leather stuff. I've done sewing. So this is one of the aspects we look at. This is this is something that they would give you. This is the basic U.S. Army fatigue cap, all right? Because this is the dress hat of the cavalry. This is what they didn't really call it a dress. It was the service hat. See, in 1855, 6 years before the Civil War started, Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War, was the Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. He decided that the Army or the cavalry should wear this style hat based after some hats worn by some people in Europe, some Hungarian cavalry guys. So he decided to make it a hat like this. The reason it's folded up on one side is so that when you're carrying your sword like this, you don't knock your head off. See? That's why it's folded up like that. It's got a nice design, American shield on the side. The yellow is the color of branch of service. And the original hats were very stiff because they actually put varnish into the black felt. It was very stiff, and a lot of soldiers didn't like it because they said it looked like a pilgrim hat. But some men just said it's better than nothing, so they wore it, and a lot of guys wore it without any insignia whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the men from the West, the Wisconsin, and men were part of what they called the Iron Brigade of the West. They preferred to wear this hat rather than this cap, and they were known as the Black Hats. They were very distinctive about that. And some of those men were sent to the Eastern Theater, and the Confederates could recognize them because they're one of the few large groups of men who chose to wear this style hat. Most people just wore this as very convenient, just as people wear baseball hats today. So he's given the uniform. The belt, the uniform I'm wearing, the leather on the waist belt is made from buffalo leather. The cartridge box and this holster is made out of cowhide. And people don't realize it, but cowhide is not as tough a leather as other forms of leather. The United States, we had plenty of buffalo leather back in the old days because there were plenty of buffalo. That's one of the things they did. That's why, the buffaloes were used. They weren't just slaughtered. I mean, the skins were used. They made overcoats out of them, and they used the buffalo leather. The U.S. Army specified that the cartridge belts were made out of buffalo leather. They called it buff leather, and if you look at the definition, it's buffalo. That's where it comes from. So I'm also given this beautiful saber. And this is, again, a traditional weapon. This is a model 1860 Cavalry Saber, which a lot of guys thought was like, wow, this is it. I just can't wait. Let me at those guys. I can't wait to get at them. And pretty early in the war, they realized that this is not the ideal weapon to use in America. For one thing, America was wooded. Europe, if you look at paintings of Europe, of the battles of the European days, like the Napoleon's campaigns, you'll see rolling fields for miles with a couple of pieces of woods here and there. And you see the stories about England where they have the King's Woods. In other words, specific areas that's got to be kept as woods. Well, America had so much woods that cavalry really couldn't do as much. And there were very few cavalry charges during the Civil War. And as in most wars, there were people who came from Europe to America to see what's going on as military observers. And they came from France, they came from Germany, they came from Italy, and they came from all the European countries. And they spent time living in amongst the U.S. Army soldiers, and there was no military secrets. I mean, the Comte de Paris, who was the descendant of the royal family of England, of France, he came to America and was a volunteer officer on the staff of General McClellan, and his two nephews were with him, and they were in Army uniform. They were serving in the U.S. Army, and they traveled around. And there was a guy from Germany, Heros von Borcke, who served with the Confederacy. He was a German Army officer, and he wore a Confederate uniform. There were people who came just to observe and then go back. And one of the things those people kept saying was, those Americans, I tell you, their use of trains. The Germans particularly studied the use of trains to move people around. In 1870, in the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans were able to move troops very quickly and very efficiently using trains to beat the French army. That's what the Germans took away. The British looked at Americans and they said, the American Navy, we got to watch out for that. So the foreign observers came and they saw the U.S. Army Cavalry, what I'm representing. And they said, you guys aren't fighting properly. And we said, well, why not? He says, you guys should use the saber. You guys should, the white arm, the arme blanche. You guys should go out there and go in there with the sabers and slash and cut and everything. And we said, they have guns. They said, I'm not too sure if it's a good idea to try and get close enough to have a sword fight with somebody who has a pistol. When you're on horseback, the sword is dangling down like this when you're galloping, right? But when you're actually walking around, you don't want it dragging it around. This device on the bottom is called the drag, and it's really there just so that it's to protect the bottom of the scabbard. So when you walk around, it drags like that. So if a guy jumps off his horse, you'll see them like this. But most times, they just hook it up like this to get out of the way. Now this pistol, all right, this is a replica, exact replica of a Colt Model 1860 revolver made in Hartford, Connecticut. 6-shot, 44 caliber. It's rifled. It's not loaded. This is how you load it. This is a loading lever. When you press this down, you put the bullet in from the front of the cylinder. The cylinder revolves. That's why they call it a revolver, right? The difference between a pistol and a revolver, this is a revolver, rotates. You line it, you put the cartridge in from the front, you bring it around and you use this to press the bullet home. After that's done, you still have to put a percussion cap on the back of each one of these here. That's why it's cut out like this. So it takes a few minutes to load the pistol, but once it's loaded, you have 6 shots, bang, 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 right? 44 caliber Army size. Many men decided that they wanted something besides that, and they would buy their own private weapon. This is an example of a privately purchased weapon. This is something officers would carry. This is a 31 caliber Model 1849 pocket pistol, very popular out west especially, and it's called the pocket pistol because it's small to put in your pocket. They made them with shorter barrels also. This is 5-shot, not 6-shot. It's made by the Colt Company also. Now these are precision weapons. This pistol cost the U.S. government $25. When you join the Army as a private like I am, I have no rank on my sleeve, my salary is $13 a month. So if I lost this pistol, they had to deduct the cost from my pay. So you had to be really careful about it. And if somebody had a pistol that didn't belong to them, they would investigate, like, where did you get that from? And they were marked U.S. on them too. Individual states bought them. But this was a precision piece of machinery. It has a lot of delicate parts in it. And the parts are interchangeable also, which is something that's a novelty for somebody coming from the farm where everything is handmade. If your door hinge broke on your front door of your house, you had to make a new hinge on the spot to fit it. You couldn't go to the store and buy a stock hinge because they didn't do that. They didn't have hardware stores with pre-made stuff. They had to be made on the spot. With something like this mass-produced, you can say, I need a new screw for that fell out and get a new one. On the other hand, you weren't supposed to take your gun apart unless you were in the presence of an officer. It's like, don't take that apart. I know you're going to lose the parts. Oh, it went into the grass. Where'd it go? Oh, no. So as a result, they had strict orders like that. This was considered high-tech, the pistols back in those days. And the sword itself, this was made, the places that made these swords, the Ames Manufacturing Company, famous for making shovels, was making swords. There were a lot of companies that made other metal products suddenly newspapers put out bids. And they said, we need somebody who can make these. And they said, who can do it? And they said, well, the companies that made plows, the companies that made shovels. They said, well, I know how to do metalworking. So that's what they did. They wound up converting to these. When the war began, there was a bit of a financial panic because a lot of southern people owed money to banks in the north, Boston and New York, Philadelphia. And when they separated, they just said, I'm not going to pay you back. So the banks suddenly said, we have to write off, this is a loss. So it was like financial panic. So, but fortunately, America's economy did not crumble because we had to buy all this stuff. We had the military in Nashua got contracts for army blankets, thousands of army blankets. Shoes, they had contracts for shoes. These are exact reproductions of shoes of the time period. It may not seem like much, but when you join the Army back in the Civil War days, it's probably the first time you ever saw shoes with laces. Most shoes had just a boot type. And even a lot of the boot type ones had buttons along the side, but they were not adjustable. It was just to help get them on. So I'll pass these around, because these are, you might have seen these a couple of years ago when I was here also, but these were, the soles are attached with wooden pegs which are like toothpicks. In the years before the Civil War, we all know about the history of the sewing machine, Elias Howe and Singer sewing machines. Well, the sewing machines originally couldn't sew through leather. I mean, the needles would break, but they developed a machine only about 3 or 4 years before the Civil War that could punch through leather and sew. So you just go down there. So sewn shoes where the sole was sewn on were better than pegged shoes. The wooden pegs, if they got wet, the wood can shrink and they would fall out and the leather gets soft. If you see a good pair of cowboy boots today, on the instep you'll see the same heads of the pegs because they still do that as a mark of tradition, to use some pegs on the bottoms of some cowboy shoes. You'll see that only on the leather parts, not on the rubber parts of the shoes. So these shoes, if anyone here has ever seen the movie Glory, one of the most important parts of the movie is where the soldiers are waiting to get their shoes issued to them. Well, the United States Army was always very careful about taking care of its men because the Army is no good without them. So the U.S. Army gave socks and they gave shoes with laces. And we think it is something normal because we've all grown up learning how to tie shoelaces. But in armies around the world, even to the 1980s, there were still armies that provided boots without shoelaces, and they didn't even provide socks. What they provided was a strip of cloth that you had to wrap around your foot a certain way. And the people who learned how to do it, they could just do it quickly, just wrap the foot around it. Even the French army in World War I and World War II was like that. They didn't have socks. They just had a strip of cloth and wrap it around. The Russians were the same way. But we always said, no, it's ridiculous. You just give the guys real shoes because we know that you got to walk long distances. Cavalrymen liked the idea of wearing boots. The U.S. Army did issue a boot for cavalrymen, but it was not the boots you see that go up to the knees. It was called a bootee. It was what some of us might remember called the beetle boots. You know, a boot about that high. You know, you just slip your foot into it, that kind of thing. That was the government issue boots for cavalrymen because they were supposed to wear it under their trousers, not outside their trousers. But a lot of men privately bought shoes, boots, just as they bought caps because they said they wanted to look like what they think a cavalryman is supposed to look like. Now, of course, it's okay for riding on horse with boots, but you can't march in boots because your foot will slide around inside, the leather gets soft and stretches, and before you know it, you get blisters. So most men realize that wearing shoes with laces is the best thing for you because you just tighten it up and the shoe fits no matter what. If the shoe gets wet, the leather stretches, you tie it tighter. If it's wintertime, you got 2 pairs of socks on, you just tie it a little differently. So these shoes were actually a bit of technology because the machinery to make them and the leather to make them was something which the North had and the South really didn't have. And the contrast in technology between the North and South is dramatic, of course, because the South being primarily agrarian. In the northern states up here, we had a lot more industry and a lot more busy people doing things, making stuff. So we had a lot of people who were always thinking of ideas. And when the war started and people said, you know, I think I can have an idea that can contribute and something which would be beneficial. So during the war, there was many inventions that came up. And one of the examples of an invention which actually predates the war a little bit is the breech-loading carbine. Now this, again, is a very expensive precision piece of equipment. This is made in Connecticut. This is a copy, exact copy, and it's a copy of a Sharp's carbine, which is unloaded. That's why I opened it up so you can see there's nothing inside. It loads from the back. It's not a muzzle loader here. And the idea is that a short-barreled weapon like this that you can load from the back is what men on horseback need. Because what the men on horseback do is they don't carry a rifle by its sling. They have a broad sling like this. And this is called a saddle ring carbine. See this ring here? That's what this large snap hook is for. So that when you're riding on horseback, you can maintain your horse while you're riding. And it jiggles around, and a good reenactor friend of mine twice, as he was riding his horse, just bouncing, the carbine bounced up and hit him in the back of the head twice. And he's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So anyway, that's one of the pratfalls, yes?
Did it take a lot of effort for the horse to put all the sword on one side and Yeah, the weaponry.
No, because the horses were trained for that. In many cases, the horses were just barely broken in when they were given to the military, so all they knew was how to ride with the stuff. And they had on the saddle, in front, you had your overcoat rolled up and tied with straps, and behind you, you had a blanket rolled up and tied with straps, 2 saddlebags on each side, and every horseman carried 2 spare horseshoes with the horseshoes already made to fit your horse. 1 shoe for the front, 1 shoe for the back because of different sizes. How many people have seen the display at the Budweiser, I was going to say refinery, the Budweiser brewery? Inside, they have a display on how they make the horseshoes for those giant horses, the Clydesdales, and they show the different steps involved. Well, in the north, we had a factory that had machinery to make horseshoes. They made them by the barrelful. The southern states still had to make them one by hand out of a bar of iron, hammering it flat, bending it to shape, punching the holes, putting the groove in for the horseshoes. And the northern states was just ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And of course, with thousands of horses. I mean, a cavalry regiment like mine had 1,500 horses. Not just men for the ride, but to pull the wagons and everything. Even the artillery, as I mentioned, six horses to pull the cannons, another 6 horses to pull the limber and ammunition chest that go with it, plus all the men that worked the cannon. If it was a horse artillery, every man had his own horse. And then you had the officers and you had the wagons, again with either mules or horses, pulling those. So you're talking about a serious amount of horse flesh there. It all had to be fed, maintained, and watered. Every morning when the cavalrymen got up, after reveille, the first thing he did was go take care of his horses. Stable call. Give your horses water, make sure they're okay. And there was always somebody what they did was they stretched the rope, when they're campaigning that is. They stretched the rope between trees and they tied the horses with a length of rope only about 6 to 8 feet long. The horses couldn't really go anywhere, but they didn't hobble horses in the army like that. But they would kept them on the rope, and somebody had to be there all night to watch them. Because sometimes and I've actually seen it, sometimes the horses get tangled up, sometimes they start fighting with each other, sometimes they flip over on the other side. The horses are animals. It's like, they're not machines like a car, which is one of the reasons why fire departments went to engines as soon as they could to get rid of those pesky animals. So we had all these horses, and the guy, the cavalryman, has to get up in the morning, has to take care of them, and then he has to go get his own breakfast, and then he has drill and practice. You have to learn how to ride a horse. And there's a lot of anecdotes about guys who didn't like having to learn a horse because the horses were mean. And I've seen it in World War I in both the American Army and the British Army where they made jokes about it. Where the sergeant says, "Get on that horse." And he says, "He doesn't like me." He says, "Well, then you just get on it." He says, "No, let me see you get on him." So there was a lot of that going on. So the reason that the guys had the carbines was so that while they're on horseback, they would have an ammunition box on their belt, or actually on their sling, and they could take a cartridge out, and they don't have to tear it. They just push the cartridge in the back because it was a combustible cartridge, close it, put a percussion cap on top here, and then fire it like that. Now, the percussion caps were a chemical marvel. Again, a farm boy never saw anything like this. Something that explodes if you just smash it. It was fulminated mercury that they put ground glass into it, and they actually had to put lead into it to dent it a little bit because it was a little too powerful. And it was put in a copper cup-shaped thing that fit on top of this little tube-like device called the cone that connects with the gunpowder. So when this hammer smashes it, the flame goes down through the channel into the cartridge, and then the bullet comes out. And being that it's black powder, it's a nice big puff of smoke. And black powder is made from potassium nitrate, charcoal, and salt. Potassium nitrate was a saltpeter, and charcoal and sulfur. And the DuPont company, we haven't heard much lately about the DuPont company, but the DuPont fortune came from making black gunpowder during the American Revolution. And they still make gunpowder today. They make a lot of chemicals besides, but they're a chemical establishment. So that's a big deal, making gunpowder. Actually, there were other things which were available. Gun cotton was available, but it was dangerous. Nitroglycerin had been discovered, but it was too dangerous to handle. So until Alfred Nobel found a way to put nitroglycerin into clay and then put it into sticks that made it safe to handle, that's what dynamite is. And that's where the Nobel Peace Prize comes from, because he got so much money from inventing dynamite, making a safe way to handle that explosive and to make it dead enough to handle. So that was another piece of technology. There wasn't any dynamite during the Civil War. It came out after the Civil War. One of the things you start studying, finding out when you study the Civil War, is the things they didn't have. We didn't have aluminum during the Civil War, because aluminum is refined by using electricity. And of course, electricity was around back in those days, but they didn't generate it in any kind of quantity. We didn't have electric lights, and we didn't have electric motors. They had battery type electricity. One of the ways we used electricity, which is how they connected along the train tracks to talk, was by the telegraph, the electric telegraph. Now, just before the Civil War started, they succeeded in laying a cable from England to the United States. It only lasted about a year or so, and it burned out. And I finally found out what happened, because everybody just gave out. They didn't know what it was. Well, it turns out if anybody knows about the history of electricity, you know that there's AC and DC, right? Well, the only electricity you had back in those days was DC, direct current voltage. We don't use direct current voltage in our power lines because it can't travel long distances. AC current can be used all over the place. Tesla was the guy who invented that. He showed that you can send high voltage over miles and miles and miles without a loss and drop in voltage because of the way it works. DC voltage, the wire itself is a resistor, so the further you get, the less electricity would be at the far end. So when they ran it across through the ocean, of course, they had to crank up the voltage so you get something at the other end enough to make a telegraph go click, 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 the little electromagnet. That's what it was. A telegraph is an electromagnet that clicks down. And if you hold it down long enough, it stays down longer. If you just make a quick one, it's short. So you get either a dot or a dash. Everybody knows SOS, right? That's the Morse code, which is the way they communicate by telegraph. And it's dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, 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 dash, dash. That's the simple thing. But there's a whole alphabet and numbers and everything is involved like that. But the transatlantic cable burned up because they had used to tie electricity. It actually burned the cable up, which is a pain, of course. They had to go with ships and grapple on the ocean bottom to try and pull it up and find out where the burn on it was. So it took a while to do that. It wasn't really successful until it came out with AC electricity. But another thing, too, is that the American Indians out west never messed with the telegraph lines. And people used to, think about it. It's like, well, why are the Indians afraid of the telegraph? It's like the singing wires. Some people said it's because the wind blowing on the wires would make like a noise. Well, the reason we're afraid of it was because wires were not insulated in those days. That's why they had the glass insulators on the telegraph poles. They only needed a pole. They didn't have two lines. The telegraph worked on a single line because they used an earth ground, which means that if you stood on the ground and you touched that wire, you got DC voltage, which is what they use in the electric chair to kill you. So the American Indians learned pretty quickly that, leave that white man's thing alone there. You know what happened last time we tried to cut that wire. Yeah, exactly. So, but the telegraph, again, was something which is a marvel. You're living out on the farm. I mean, you didn't talk to your neighbor. I mean, you had to go visit him. Now, telephones came in. A lot of people didn't have telephones in the 1950s even. So the telegraph was pretty good. And whenever they built the railroad, they tried to string the telegraph lines alongside it because it was easy. I mean, you already had a nice path to go. And the train tracks themselves in America were made out of iron rails. And in all the 11 southern states, there's only one factory that could make railroad iron. Railroads in those days were made by independent companies, right? It was not a government project. We talk about bringing rail to New Hampshire, and we want the government to pay for it, right? In the old days, it was a private person would say, I want to build a railroad between Nashua and Boston. I will get my friends to invest in it, and the money we get from charging 2 cents a mile to go on the train will pay us back. So as a result, America, at the time of the Civil War, had a lot of independent train tracks that weren't connected to each other. So when the war began, we wanted to send men to Washington, D.C. Well, if you from Nashua, you had to take a train to Boston. From Boston, they really didn't have too many trains going from Boston to New York City because of all the rivers in Connecticut that went north and south there, all the bridges that were just too expensive. So they built the railroad the length of Long Island, New York, which was all flat, made of sand, glacial sand. And they would take a short ferry across to Long Island, then take a train to New York City. And from New York City, they would take a train, go across the river, take a train the length of New Jersey to Philadelphia. And from Philadelphia, change over to go to Baltimore. And then at Baltimore, you had to get out of the train station and go across town to the other station, which is the one that took it to Washington, D.C. So there was a lot of that back in those days. As a matter of fact, what happened was the 6th Massachusetts Regiment was one of the first regiments to go down to Washington, D.C., actually the first ones to try it. And they actually, in Baltimore, they had to go from the train station across the city of Baltimore, and Baltimore Maryland was a slave state. So there was a lot of people who turned out. They said, where do you think you guys going? I says, we're going down to, help you know, President Lincoln asked for volunteers to stop the rebellion. So naturally, the people in the town, they didn't really go along with that. So they turned out, and there was riots, and they started throwing rocks, and a shot was fired, and like about a half dozen people from Massachusetts were killed, and guys were seriously wounded, and some equipment was captured. There was a drum captured from the soldiers and was returned after the war. And it was a big fuss. And after that, they went by ferry around rather than taking the trains through Philadelphia, just to avoid that. And the boats they took were interesting too, because the technology of riding on a boat back in those days was something, still a bit of a novelty, because steam power was only like 20, 30 years old. So if somebody was 20 years old, this was something that was still relatively new. It's not like today where we expect things to be new. I mean, the new iPhones come out like every year or so. Back in those days, things didn't change. So a lot of the ships back then were side-wheelers, as we see here. Now, the side-wheeler, go back to the first days of Robert Fulton and stuff like that, like 1820 or so. Before that, sailing ships could only sail they couldn't really sail up a river easily unless you could tack back and forth. So if you wanted to go up a narrow river, we were really in trouble. So with a steamship, when they invented a steamship, the first guy who made money on a steamship made it sailing up the Hudson River, because you didn't have to make a difference which way the wind is blowing. You could just go up and down the river. In the ocean, it's another matter. But that's why there was so many shipwrecks in the old days, because every time there was a big storm, the ships would be blown up on the beaches and wrecked. And so as a result, we had a lot of steam-powered ships that came out right away. People said, this is where the money is. Now, not everyone was a side-wheeler. There were what they call screw steamers, which had a propeller on the back. And the British actually had a contest between the two ships as a tug of war to see which is more efficient, the propeller or the side-wheeler. And they found out that the propeller was more powerful. Well, we had all these ships. So we had steam-powered ships. Big problem, of course, is that you have the boiler. The boiler is full of steam. Any hole in that thing will cause it to blow up. You can see photographs from World War II of airplanes strafing locomotives, and the steam comes out like crazy because it takes just a couple holes in there, and that's it. So when they built ships, they tried to put the boiler below water level, so if a cannonball hit, it wouldn't damage it. So again, American ingenuity came out, and when the war started, the southern states said they needed a navy, so they said, well, what are we going to do? So there was not a single factory in all the 11 southern states that could make a ship's propeller shaft. That's how bad the technology was, right? So they said, well, we can make railroad iron. We could, this is a sample of a railroad track, right? This is made out of steel, but in those days it was made out of iron. And this is the part that's ridden on. And believe it or not, this type of configuration wasn't firmly established by the time of the Civil War. There were still tracks that were made by laying wood like a 2x4 on end with a metal strap along the top. Now, how many remember taking the foil from a gum wrapper and rubbing it on the table, and you wind up seeing it curl up? Well, that's what happened to the iron strap on these wooden train tracks. Eventually, the train's running across it, the metal would curl, and it would pop the nails up, and it was called a snakehead because it would pop up, and the head sticking up would just rip through the back of the railroad cars, taking people's legs off. Yeah, that was... in the last year of the Civil War, more people died from train accidents than in battle. That was one of the things in those days. Artificial limbs, the business of making artificial legs and arms catered to the people who lost them in train accidents. The train locomotive, this lamp on the front is a single flame kerosene lamp. You can imagine that it doesn't light very much ahead of the train. So if you were running a train at nighttime, it was the engineers were highly respected because their lives were in their hands, and of course everybody behind them too. I mean, the guy was always leaning out the window to look out ahead to see if there's anything on the track. And of course, being that it was wartime, there's the possibility of people cutting the timbers on bridges and sabotage and everything. So very risky business, a lot of train accidents, not to mention the fact that they built a lot of train tracks very quickly during the war because the wartime, it's like quick laid tracks. And both sides would destroy tracks if they could. So there was a big business in destroying tracks. As a matter of fact, the rails, the long sections of rail, some of the northern guys, when they went down south to Atlanta, they dismantled the train tracks so the Confederates couldn't use them. And one of the things they do is they make a bonfire of the railroad ties and lay the rails across the bonfire. And then when it got glowing red, guys would take the end of the rail and run up against a tree and wrap the railroad tie around a tree so you could not use it again. They called them Sherman's neckties. So that way they could deny them. They just couldn't rebuild the train track right away. So that was one aspect of it too. Something which, if you were in the Army from a farm person, you got to travel long distances, you got to see all this fantastic stuff, you got to see the Army in motion, thousands of people working in harmony, and you got to see what this technology could do. I mean, when did you know that, and how did you know about locomotives? I mean, there was no textbooks in school. The only textbook you might have had in school was the Bible, and that was only there just to teach you to read. It was the only book that people had. In New York State in the 1830s, they banned the Bible from school because that was the only book they had, and people were saying, I thought you're not supposed to have religion and government mixed, so yet you're having people read the Bible. I said, okay, from now on, just no Bibles. We'll have real textbooks. And that's when they started coming up with all this stuff. Now, the southern states, there were some people down there. The people that made up the Confederate Navy and the Confederate Army were basically Americans who were in the American Army and American Navy when the war started. They just went to the other side. Robert E. Lee, of course, was a colonel in the U.S. Army, and he became general in the Confederacy. So these men said, we got to find a way to even the odds with the North. The North has a lot of ships and a lot of technology. We have the technology, but we don't really have the ability to put that technology into use. So what they did was they cheated. They took a ship, a sailing ship, that had been abandoned by the North. There was a Navy yard in Norfolk, Virginia, that the town where all the workers lived in was sympathetic to the Southern cause, and they basically just rose up and swarmed into the Navy base and took it over. But the Navy guys in charge of it, they knew something was going on, so they signaled, we need help right away. So what did they send for help? They sent a sailing ship. And the sailing ship can't really move very fast, couldn't really do much. So by the time it got there, it was a little too late, and the people knew what was going on, so they ran to the base, and the Union guys, there was a ship there that had engine trouble, and they couldn't get it out, so they said, we're not going to leave an intact ship of war for the bad guys. So they sank it at the pier, and then they set fire to it. So the entire top half was burned off. The Southerners looked at it, and they said, you know, it's because it sank at the pier, a lot more of it is underwater than normally. So the only part that burned off was like the masts and stuff like that. So they said, being it's right there at the pier, we can raise it, and the engines are still good. So they did that, and what they did was they decided to substitute the sailing part of it with iron planks. They cover with wood, and they had strips of iron on it, and they actually had 2 inches of iron with 8 inches of wood behind it. It was 24 inches of wood and 4 inches of iron, 2 layers of 2-inch thick iron. It wasn't steel, it was iron. When the Confederacy was trying to make the ship, they said, let's test this first. They said, we'll make it with 1 2-inch layer of iron and 6 inches of oak. So they set up a test sample, and they fired a cannonball at it, right through. So they said, oh, I think we better like double the amount of wood and double the amount of metal. So this is what the configuration it took. It had regular muzzle-loading cannons. It had 12 of them. It had 1 on each end, which could shoot out diagonally, and then it had ones on the side. And you see the smokestack. The smokestack is important because the wind blowing across it creates the draft, which pulls the air through the fire to create the steam, right? Well, in the first battle it was in, cannonballs bounced off the side of this, but they shot holes through the smokestack, reducing the draft, so the engine weren't as efficient. It couldn't go as fast as it normally does. Plus the fact that when they loaded it down with all this iron, it took up so much water that it really couldn't go into the channels of the river that they needed to go into. There was, like most rivers, they didn't really dredge in those days. There was a natural channel. The rest of it was like shallow water, like swampy stuff. They had to stay in the middle. So when this was finally ready, the Confederates sailed it out of the Norfolk Harbor, and there were Union blockade ships there, and right away, they started firing at it. They saw it coming. They saw the smoke coming out of the smokestack, and they started pounding away at it, and the cannonballs bounced off. And the guys were like, uh-oh. And the thing just kept coming and coming and coming. And the guns on here were pounding away at the Cumberland and the Minnesota and the Congress, and the guys on the ship would just fire, just keep shooting, and they're bouncing off and exploding on the side. Nothing was happening. And this thing just went right up. The point of this is a cast iron prow. It actually deliberately rammed and crunched into the ship, punching a hole in it. Now, the problem, of course, is that it tried to back out. The ship started sinking, and it couldn't back out. So it's like, oh. So finally, it broke loose, but the cast iron prow snapped off inside the ship. So anyway, it backed off. So the 2 ships were destroyed. the third ship, the Minnesota, there were sailing ships, so they didn't have steam power. They couldn't move on their own. This guy just came up and just bang, 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 sank them. So the third ship tried to get away, put the sails up, and it tried to get out of the way and wound up running on the ground. It was beached basically on the shallow water, and it couldn't move. So the guy said, quick, throw everything over the side that you can. And the interesting part is that naval battles around the world at this time were usually, the guys would surrender. And the tradition was if you had 10 or 15% casualties, you surrender. But the Union ships didn't surrender. They just kept firing. Even while they were sinking, they kept firing and firing. And the captain of the Confederate ship actually got ticked off, and he said, you guys aren't playing fair. So he got so angry, he actually came out of the ship with a rifle to shake his fist and take a shot at the thing. And of course, why would you come out of an armored ship? So he got shot in the leg right away. And it's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. So his deputy commander had to take over. He said, let's go back. I think we'd done enough damage for one day, so they went back, right? So they got back into the harbor. That night, the Union answer to that ship appeared, the USS Monitor, which we knew the Confederacy was building that ship. We also knew that they didn't have the technology, and it took them a lot longer to build it. It took them from August until March. March 8th is when the battle took place, 1862. Like last week, imagine the weather and everything. So we knew that something was going on. They already knew that the ship was being built. We had some ideas about it. The newspapers are pretty vocal about it. We got the secret weapons going to come and get you, and we knew what was going on. They couldn't really keep a secret back in those days. So the United States Navy said, what are we going to do? He said, let's put out for bids for an ironclad ship to answer their ironclad ship. So there's a long, tedious process about it. And actually, the National Library, a gentleman wrote a book about the battle, gave a talk a couple of years back, and I had a nice chance, and I read his book, and it's full of detail. But basically, there was a lot of personalities involved because John Erickson, the guy who just made the Monitor, there was a lot of political issues where he was on the bad side of the people in the administration because he had designed a ship, which was a screw steam, which was very successful, very high tech. And he designed a cannon. But the manufacturer of the cannon didn't make it properly, and it exploded, and it killed the Secretary of Navy. So, and they blamed him, and he got all upset saying, don't blame me, it was the guys who made it. It wasn't my design. So anyway, when they needed a design for the ship, he had to be talked into coming down to present his model of the ship before the board, and they said, there might be something in it. And anyway, when they showed the design to President Lincoln, he said, well, it sure doesn't look like anything on this earth. It's not blasphemy to make it because it doesn't look like anything that God ever made. So they started making it. They gave him 99 days to make the ship. So the original ship design was to have a rounded deck, and the turret was to be like bubble shaped. Of course, they couldn't do that quickly. Having the idea and the technology is a different thing. Plus the fact ironworking was difficult. So they farmed out the work, right? There was a novelty company that made steam engines, made the engine for him of his own design because it had to fit very low into the space. The metal plates were ordered from all different places because they needed a hurry. And does anybody here know what Nashua's contribution to the Monitor was?
The gun ports.
We made the stoppers for the gun ports. The turret of the Monitor was 9 feet tall, 20 feet in diameter, and it was layers of iron with nice big rivets around it. And the cutouts for the cannons to stick out had two 11-inch diameter cannons. The muzzles were 11 inches in diameter. The holes cut out for that. They decided that maybe when we pull the cannon in to load it, being that it's armored, it'd be not a good idea to have this big open hole on the ship. So they made a swinging shutter to block the hole so that riflemen or the other guy's ship's cannonballs can't come into the turret because all it takes is one cannonball and the ship is disabled. Exploding inside the turret, kill everybody. So our foundry here, by that CVS that's under construction there, then the parking lot behind it is a granite marker with a bronze plate which should be refinished because it's all verdigris green. But it points out that the foundry across the street there is where they made the cast iron shutters for the Monitor. So that was our contribution. It was actually, the rest of the ship was built and assembled in New York City. And they rushed it, and they sent it down from New York City down along the coast of New Jersey. And it met a storm on the way there and almost drowned. Water came splashing in. John Erickson said the turret, where it meets the hull, the weight will make it waterproof, but they didn't believe him, so they decided to put a rope as a gasket, and the rope gasket leaked, and water came inside and got inside the furnace, almost put the fire out with no propeller, no steam engine, steam power. It was going to be totally the mercy of the storms. It was a disaster. They finally arrived there. They arrived at night after the Virginia had come in and destroyed the ships. They arrived and they see the ship on fire. They see the masts of another ship sticking out of the ocean. And the captain of the Minnesota is like, where were you when we needed you? So everybody looked at this monitor, which was, we're talking about a two-decker warship with like 48 cannons. You know these cannons out here by the Civil War Monument?
Yes.
Well, the Minnesota had 48 of those. That's why those things are all over New England here, because, when the wars were over and they got rid of those sailing ships, they got like, you want a cannon? Take one. So everybody's got one. I mean, Hudson has got two. They're all over the place, the same type cannons. Most of them are naval cannons because they just needed so many. So anyway, the ship got there just in time that night, and the next morning when the Virginia came out to finish off the ship there, the Minnesota, which was still stuck on the ground, they were throwing stuff overboard and everything, and the captain of Minnesota was in charge. He says, your job is to protect my ship. So that was the mission of the Monitor, was to protect the USS Minnesota. So when the Confederate ships sailed out, they saw the smoke in the distance, and they said, here it comes, and they started firing cannons at it and bouncing off. And then the Monitor pulled out from behind the Minnesota, and people were like, what is that? And it was such a small target. And so the ensuing battle was interesting because we had two indestructible ships fighting each other. And basically, that's what happened. It was a tie. The Southern ship was damaged more than the Union ship. So the Virginia had to pull back again. It had the smokestack was so full of holes. A couple of guys had been killed because they made the mistake of leaning up against the wall of the ship, and it was hit by a cannonball on the other side, and it messed them up. So the Southern ship actually turned back for home, and the Union ship, what happened was the Union ship pulled back into shallow water because its ship captain had been looking at a viewport, and a cannonball hit the viewport and it kind of blinded him. So he had a deputy commander in charge, and he said, well, pull back until we figure out what we're doing. And the Confederates thought they gave up, so they went back. So the Confederates thought that they won, the Union guys thought they won, but the mission of the Monitor was to protect the Minnesota, and it did it. So that's something that worldwide, that battle, March 8, 1862, with Nashua's contribution on it, revolutionized world history. And because the original ship, the Virginia, I think most of you might know the name of that ship was the Merrimack, because it was named after the Merrimack River. The U.S. Navy named the ships after important ships after rivers. There was a Sewanee and other ones. The Monitor was all by itself. And they asked Erickson, they said, this will be a monitor. It'll keep an eye on things, like a hall monitor in school kind of thing. So that's where it came from. And it was very quickly made, so they just quickly said, make us more. So all the monitors made after that had improvements on it. But the first monitor, the part was made here. We might have made parts for other ones, but nobody cares about the later ones. All they care about is the first. So that's an example. And when that battle took place, it took place in a harbor where the U.S. Army forts along the shore, thousands and thousands of soldiers were on the shore watching this battle take place. I mean, we're talking about it took place like a half a mile to a mile away from where you're standing. The smoke is blowing. The cannons on the forts are firing at the Confederate ship. The Union ships, there was other smaller ships, so they were part of the blockade. They came up to try and shoot at it. And the two small Confederate ships came up to try and help, and they got beat up and they went back. But that battle, all of a sudden the British Empire, which relied on its navy to protect its sea lanes, and one of the basics of world diplomacy back in those days was if you control the seas, you control the world. And that's why England was so fanatical about maintaining their navy. Because if you don't have a navy, then somebody can blockade your port and you have no business. You cannot do anything. Of course, England's whole country was based on trade, bringing raw materials in. And that's one of the reasons we have a civil war in the first place, is because England was buying raw materials from the United States, and the southern states were selling the raw materials, and our factories were saying, we need the cotton, we need the wool, and the southern states were saying, well, these guys are paying for it. They'll buy it more. So the first thing happened when the war started was the southern states said, we're not going to send any more cotton to Europe, because that'll make the Europeans come to our aid. What happened was they didn't. So as a result, the French and the British stayed neutral, and the Confederacy was on its own, and that's what happened. But the Battle of the Monitor, the Merrimack, and Nashua's contribution to that is world famous. just the name Merrimack by itself. And it's interesting because even the way the spelling with it, Merrimack with a C and a K, you see that both ways all the time. And there's a Merrimack, New Hampshire, there's a Merrimack, Massachusetts. It's one of those deals. So I've just touched on some of that, but one interesting aspect of the technology is the food aspect of it. Because I mentioned before that most people had never really had a good meal or a good system of eating until they joined the Army. Because all of a sudden now there was plenty of food. Every day the government gave you a pound of food and a pound of bread. And if you couldn't get fresh bread, the government had something else to give you. And they would you were carried it in your haversack. Evelyn, would you help me out for a second, please, here? My daughter, Evelyn. Now, I have recreated exactly what the Army bread of the period was, which is called hardtack. And I'll pass it around so you can all look at it. And here, take this one. Yes. You can see why they call it hardtack. Now, a pound of bread per day was the ration of food, and every person also got a half a pound of meat per day, which was a luxury. Every soldier was given a tin cup, and the tin cup was what you cooked your food in, you boiled it in. The tin plates were used because they don't break, and every soldier had one. You can take one to keep if you like as a souvenir. Now, this is what a cup looked like after you've boiled coffee on a fire. A nice shiny tin cup like this didn't last very long. So you knew this person was a new recruit if he had a nice shiny tin cup. The food was issued uncooked. The meat issued was most often was salt pork, which is pork that's not cooked but cured in salt. And you could eat it raw or you could cook it. So pork was the main staple of Americans' diet at that time period. Beef did not become a big part of the diet until after the 1870s, 1880s, the cowboy days, where they were able to bring the cows to the meat packing plants in Chicago and all that stuff. So the food aspect of it, the technology, these were made in factories that produced them. Some people called them crackers, but some people call them ship's biscuits also, because if you went on a ship, or if you went into a general store back in those days, the Cracker Barrel, it was the same formula. It may not be the same shape, but it was the same thing, flour and water biscuits, because it would travel. Now, does anybody have any questions about the aspects of what I've been talking about? I'll take some questions now. I think we're pretty good time-wise. We have some few minutes left. Now, the war itself, of course, ended in 1865. And when that ended, America had already established itself as a very important place in the world economy. And the other countries looked at America in awe. Now, how many people have heard or seen the movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? Jules Verne? Yeah. Well, Jules Verne, in quite a bit of his writings, put Americans as the genius people, the scientists. Captain Nemo himself, by the way, was supposed to be Indian, from India, who was very much opposed to the British government's running of India. But I recently read another book that Jules Verne's read, besides 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And that book is Mysterious Island. Now, they made a very good movie of it, but like most movies, it's the Hollywood version of it. But the basic story written by this Frenchman who admired America so much is that in Richmond Prison in 1865, there's a U.S. Army engineer, and there's a sailor and a 15-year-old boy who's a sailor boy. And they are with a newspaperman from the north who's held prisoner also, and they escape in a balloon. The southern states were, city of Richmond has been surrounded. The southerners had made a balloon, and we're going to use it to get out of Richmond. But a storm came, and before the storm cleared, the U.S. Army engineer officer, captain, and the men got into the balloon with the dog and were blown away in what turned out to be a hurricane. Now, of course, they're stretching a little bit because in his story, he has the balloon blown by the hurricane from Richmond, Virginia, out into the Pacific Ocean near Tasmania. That is stretching it a little bit, but yeah, in the book, when they finally find out where they are, that's where they are. They're between South America and Australia. Tasmania out there. So anyway, the thing is, in this book, he shows that with the technology that the Americans had, The first thing they do on this island, they're on the island, no tools, no steel, nothing, no matches or anything. The first thing they do is make mud bricks to make a kiln so they can bake real bricks. And with those real bricks, they make a furnace and they get natural iron ore and start making their own iron tools, and they start making pottery. And within a year or two, they have tools and they have everything they need, and they're able to make nitroglycerin to blow some rocks up. Once they're able to make sulfuric acid and nitric acid, and that's the way it is back in those days. I mean, the people back in those days were a lot closer to things. Today, we rely so much on stuff that you have no idea what goes inside your iPhone. I bet you if you ask the average kid and say, what do they make the glass out of your device out of, where's the raw material come from, he won't know that it comes from silica sand, beach sand, and that's basically the raw material of it. You mix it with some other ingredients and you get, this nice clear beach sand. So that's the aspect of technology that when I study the Civil War, I look at these things and I can say, this is what they had back in those days. There are people, friends of mine, who studied medicine in the Civil War time period, and they look at it also and they say, this is easy by our standards, because in those days you only needed to study for 2 years to be a doctor. So when the person was finished with the Civil War, and they finished seeing all this technology, not to mention seeing canned food for the first time, when they came back home, they had a whole different view on life. Now, some people might remember the last time I closed my lecture by talking about this product here, Eagle brand condensed milk, which is available today in every store. And it was invented or developed by a man, Gail Borden, who patented the process of taking milk and heating it up under vacuum. So because at a vacuum, things boil at a lower temperature. So it'll actually boil before it gets to that custard, cruddy thing. When you heat up milk on the stove, you get that scum on top, Nobody likes that. So anyway, he was able to patent this process, and he was making condensed milk. The Union Army bought the stuff by the caseload because it doesn't need refrigeration, just like you'd have some in your cupboard. And he named it Eagle brand because very patriotic, used to have American Eagle on it. And of course, later on, they wound up using the cow design of Elsie as the symbol for the Borden Company. The guy's name was Gail Borden. And later on in the 1930s, they developed a way of making glue from milk, from the stickiness of the milk and stuff, the casein. And that was Elmer's glue, because Elsie here, her husband was Elmer. So when I've talked about this when I give Civil War presentations, but a few months ago on Facebook, on one of the websites for Civil War civilian stuff, I showed a picture of this and I explained that to them. Got over 700 shares. Because people didn't know that. I mean, it's something that I knew from years back of studying, but Borden's condensed milk was available during the Civil War. It was bought by people. The government bought it. It was privately made. And at the time, the U.S. military didn't know exactly how he did it because it was kept proprietary. Even though he had a patent, the actual process of making it, he kind of kept as like an industrial secret. So when you go to the stores today, this is the exact same stuff they had. And they use it in their coffee because the U.S. government gave coffee to the men to drink. The U.S. Army had abolished the liquor ration in 1838 and they replaced it with coffee. Many men had never had coffee before they joined the Army. And of course, once they left the Army, that's what they said. It's great, I love coffee. Unfortunately, a lot of guys also developed a taste for tobacco. This is a twist of tobacco. Tobacco leads men into a twist. Most people in those days smoked pipes rather than cigars, and cigarettes didn't come out to the 1870s, 1880s. So as this is just a smattering of the technology available back in those time period. And of course, matches were available too. And the matches took the place of what everybody used to carry was a piece of stone, flint, and a piece of steel. Yeah. Okay. This is cantankerous. But that's the way people used to start a fire. They would actually get moss or tinder together and make a fire. And then, of course, later on, they actually had these for about 20 years before, but nobody on a farm would pay for matches. They would just carry the steel and the rock with them all the time. And all of a sudden, it was like there you go, there's a match. Like that. A miracle. And this was an extravagance back in those days. The U.S. Army issued matches. And the funny thing is, they also made matches in the form of a block where they just cut it so it was like an inch by an inch square with all the matches standing up. So what we see is a matchbook like that. They made them out of wood like that also. But the chemicals on the end of it, the phosphor and everything, you just can't make on a farm. It was made in a laboratory. So that's another aspect of technology.
How did they get the boys back on the farm?
That's why New Hampshire is 95% wooded today, because many people just did not come back to their farms in New Hampshire when the war ended. For one thing, there really wasn't much to come back to. I mean, you weren't going to inherit the farm if you had 3 or 4 brothers. And plus, you got to see people from Wisconsin, from Minnesota, and they told you about the vast prairies out there with the sod 3 feet thick that you can. And the 1862 President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, which was one of the things in the Republican Party platform, because the Southerners, for some reason, were dead fast opposed to the Homestead Act because they wanted it only if they could allow slavery into those states. But the Homestead Act meant that if you settled on land and lived on it for 5 years, it was your land. And if you wanted to buy it, you could buy it for $1.25 an acre ahead of time without living there for 5 years. So that's where you got the big land drives. Everybody they says, 1, 2, 3, go. Everybody charges out there, and whatever you put the stake in the ground, that's yours. So, why go back to a farm in New England where the snow and the rocks and everything, where you can have farmland all of your own?
I'd also heard that another reason for the Civil War was the southern states wanted to push slavery into the West.
Yes, that was one of the big issues was the spread of slavery, because there was nothing constitutionally to prohibit the federal government from banishing slavery, but the northern people were saying that, no, you see, the Declaration of Independence says we recognize that all men are created equal. So this part of the Constitution and this part of the Declaration of Independence is against slavery. So that's where the conflict took place. You had people on both sides who said that they were legally all right. But the southern states, of course, that some of the people did not like that. Kansas became a state in 1861. And in the 10 years before that, there was such a fractional dispute between whether the state was going to vote for it, the issue of what they call popular sovereignty, as to whether the people can choose what they want. It's hard to believe, but actually in Kansas, the population voted not to have slavery, but the governor, because it was a territory, the governor was appointed by the federal government, and the governor vetoed it. So you had a lot of problems going on there. So that's one aspect. And if you go to any books, if you go to the library, any place, you'll see thousands of books written on the American Civil War. And it's a very popular subject. And publishers today refuse new titles because they just have so many books. And books on Abraham Lincoln are written every day. So I don't have to encourage any of you people to study history, because that's what you're here. The Historical Society is here to preserve this history. Yes?
Wasn't the Monitor lost at sea during a storm, not a battle, and then they found the remains a few years ago, and I don't know, did they ever bring it back up?
The USS Monitor, he's talking about what's now known as the U.S. Monitor National Marine Sanctuary off the coast of Virginia, Hatteras, Virginia. The Monitor, being the first one made, was kind of experimental. It really was so low. It had an 18-inch freeboard, which means the deck of the ship was 18 inches above the water if it's calm water. So unfortunately, it was sailing from one port to another, and a storm came, and it got tossed around so much that water actually came in the top of the turret and put the fires out in the steam engines. And the belts and the drive were made out of leather, and they stretched so the propellers wouldn't turn it. They wound up abandoning it as it sank, and it sank in the water, and it was only discovered in the 1980s, where it rested on the bottom of the ocean. So today they've been bringing pieces of it up for restoration, and there's a museum dedicated to it. And the Northrop Grumman Company actually built out of sheet metal a full-size replica of the USS Monitor outside the museum. Because it's not that big. It's 100 feet long by like 30 feet wide. So anyway, the Civil War is a part of American history. And there are people today around the world who have a different idea of what a civil war is. I mean, we all know the situation with the Syrian refugees, but it's hard to imagine. But during the Civil War, the United States took in those 5 years, 1861, 1865, 800,000 immigrants in those 5 years. There were people coming to America in the middle of our Civil War. So, I don't know, why aren't people going to Syria?
Wow.
All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.